Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic that is not directly related to the research that we're doing out in IIT Hyderabad, but it's a very crucial point that needs to be discussed, which is about the ethics in psychology research. I also would like to stress over here about how important it is to understand, honor, and practice ethics, especially in psychology research. And I'll be talking about why, how, and what are the important things to bear in mind when we're talking about ethics in research. Um, I came across this topic well before I even started doing the research that I'm doing in IIT Hyderabad. This was way back during my master's years when I was in the UK. And before I started having to come over to do research in India, at that time I was doing work in cancer. But we were looking at coping in cancer and gender differences and things like that. And my supervisor at that time had said, "Hey, have you prepared your informed consent sheet and etc.?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And that's when I discovered this entire topic that was under discussed in India at that time. And I discovered that, we don't know very much about ethics, and there is so much of psychology research that is still conducted in India that has not received or obtained the requisite ethics approval or clearance, and hasn't really, even if you've received this ethics approval, they haven't really conducted their research in an ethical manner, or at least discussed how they conducted this research, and thereby alluding to the ethics that were practiced during the conducting of this research. And I'm also a member of the Institutional Ethics Committee in IIT Hyderabad, and I have encountered situations where I've had to explain why certain research needs ethical approval. Now, that said, this particular talk, I've modified it now, but overall I had delivered this talk at the University of Hyderabad, Hyderabad's ethics workshop that was held earlier in 2015. Now, why psychology? I was asked to deliver this talk as a psychologist in Hyderabad who does plenty of research with human participants. And even for my psychology listeners, it's important to understand that we as psychologists, we're interested in human behavior. So we end up interviewing and interacting with human participants, right? So it becomes the cornerstone of psychology research. And our ultimate goal is, in fact, to provide these individuals or individuals at large with a better understanding of themselves, provide them well-being, and provide them care, right? So we are studying individuals in order to provide them even more understanding or even more opportunities to take care of themselves. So some examples of psychology research that is conducted with human participants to sort of give my psychology and my non-psychology listeners an idea about how does psychology, or why does psychology need ethics approval and conduct its research in an ethical manner. So now, as you can see on your screen, say for example social psychology. It explores group behavior, altruism, interpersonal relationships. Cognitive psychology, it explores information processing, memory, visual processing. Health psychology, medical decision making, coping with illness, health behavior change. Or even counseling psychology, where we're looking at the efficacy or the feasibility of certain counseling techniques. Say for example, how does mindfulness impact well-being? Multicultural counseling, career decision making, or even developmental psychology, childhood experiences, parenting and its relationship with child development, the impact of different types of care. So you can see that all these major fields that you'll see especially occurring in India or being picked by students in India, these are fields that have a lot to do with humans or the study of humans, and therefore requiring human participants, right? And all this research may impact the psychological or the emotional well-being of the participant that is being studied. And therefore, ethics in this field becomes extremely important. So the need for ethics in principles. Now, psychologists, whenever you are going out into the field to do your data collection, you must ask and must answer these type of questions. First question, are we putting our participants at any possible risk? Are the questions that we are going to be asking, are they emotionally upsetting? Is our experimental condition harmful? So especially in interventional research or RCTs, you'd ask the question of, does my research question cause any form of harm to my patient or to my participant? And how are we storing this data? At the end of it, are we protecting the confidentiality and the anonymity of these participants? So these are the kind of questions anybody who is going out into the field must ask and must make sure that they've answered these questions. Now, the considerations in the conduct of research with humans. Some of the important, about 4 key considerations one must make is, first, are we placing the participants at any possible risk or even minimal risk? So we have to divide them into these groups. Individuals who will experience, that is the at-risk group, and or the individuals who may not experience, that is a minimal risk group, of any harmful effects that are experienced due to participating in the study. And if there are any risks, minimal or complete risk, we should inform our participants of any such risks. And then there is also the question of obtaining informed consents, and I will be talking about these informed consent and debriefing in the subsequent slides. If deception is being used in research, again, I will be talking about deception in the subsequent slides. Then we need to inform the participants in advance or at the completion of the study. And we should ensure that every participant is debriefed at the end of the study. Now, what are the considerations that need to be taken when we're dealing with vulnerable population? So, vulnerable population are populations that are, as it explains, vulnerable. So, first of all, we need to take into account the health of the participants. Are they psychologically, emotionally, socially, and physically stable? And if they're not considered stable or, quote unquote, normal, then we need to take into account how are we going to ensure that we don't unstable whatever that state they are in. Now, vulnerable populations are also people who are too old or too young. So we need to take into consideration how are we going to deal with these participants. And also the ability of the participant to understand what participating in the study means. So examples are patients with mental or physical disorders, people with lower intelligence, low literacy levels, where English is not their primary language. Are we taking into account these kind of populations? How are we going to make sure that these vulnerable populations are not being put at risk? Now, if there is risk or harm, then the researcher is obligated to protect the participants from any kind of physical or psychological harm. So say, for example, some participants may feel more anxious, more angry. It might lower their self-esteem, especially when it comes to situations where they feel they've been misled, shortchanged, or in a disadvantageous position. So we need to ensure that we are protecting their sense of integrity. And 2 ways in which we try and ensure this is, 1, obtaining informed consent from the participants, and ensuring that debriefing is conducted at the end of the study. Now, I've been talking on and on and on about this informed consent, right? And what informed consent basically entails is two things. One is getting a participant information sheet, right? And the second one is actually getting informed consent from the participant. But let's talk about the informed information sheet. Now, the information sheet should contain first the title and the introduction to the study along with the lead researcher's details, so the participant knows very well what the study is all about and also the people involved in the study. Then the purpose of the study, why is the study being conducted, and what will the participation in the study involve. So does that involve answering a bunch of questions? Does that involve a tape recorded interview? Does that involve doing a couple of tasks that will be recorded? So we need to explain what actually they need to do. Then give them information on the privacy, data storage, and dissemination of the information. So are we ensuring that confidentiality and anonymity is being maintained? How are we storing the data? Now it's typically expected that the data is secured for 7 years before it's destroyed. And then how is this information being disseminated? Are we ensuring that their information is coded, for example? And then are we putting up this information in conferences? Are we publishing this information? Are we producing reports for the institution where it was conducted, etc., etc.? Now describe the possible risks and benefits in participation. And then reassure the participation is not obligatory, that they can withdraw the participation at any point. They could not want to participate right at the start of the study, or even in between the study, or even after the study, but before it's disseminated. Then information on ethics approval, so that the study has received ethics approval from wherever, and the people that they need to contact should they feel any kind of emotional upset. Now the second part of the informed consent is the informed consent form. Okay, so the form looks something like what you see on your screen right now. There should be the title of the study, the investigators, so their names, designation, and affiliation, and the consent form should address the fact that they consent to take part in the study, that they have read or have been read the information sheet and they understand the nature and the purpose of the study. They have been allowed to ask as many questions and they've been answered, and that they understand that participation is absolutely voluntary, and if they did not want to participate, it does not affect them in any way, and that all the information that's been gained from them in the study will be treated confidentially. Now we need to get the participant's name, signature, and the date. Now if they can't give you informed consent in writing, then we need to obtain it verbally. So we were talking about deception, right? And the question really is, and what usually ethics committees will ask is it really necessary? Now in psychology research, yes. Sometimes it is necessary because sometimes there is social desirability that plays, and our participants may alter their responses or their performance in order to please the researcher. Now we can do deception in two ways. One is passive deception or omission, where the researcher deliberately does not give the participants some information about the study, where they believe that this information would lead them to give a biased response, or active deception, which is also called commission, where the participant is actively misled about the specific purpose of the study. Now, if deception is needed in the study, then there are certain kind of guidelines. The first is one needs to justify why this deception is needed, especially in terms of the benefits that the participant would get, and that this far outweighs the risks that the participant will experience. Then The researcher cannot conceal from the participants any significant aspects of the study that is expected to cause any kind of physical pain or severe emotional stress. Then the researcher must also provide the participants with debriefing. So after the deception is completed, the participant should be informed that there was deception and what was the nature of this deception. Now, the alternatives for deception. So usually, again, ethics committees will ask if these three forms of alternatives could be used. And it is important for researchers to consider whether they could use these forms. Now, one is the simulation studies, where it's a variation on role playing, where it involves a level of simulation of a real world situation. So the Stanford prison experiment is a good example of that. And then it has a high degree of involvement from the participants, and therefore there are very high costs, as was evidenced in the Stanford prison experiment. So it's less preferred. The other less researched method is vignette studies, where a hypothetical situation is presented to the participants, and they're asked how would they have potentially responded to this. So they're like, say, for example, disease label studies that, for example, Jane Ogden has conducted. However, these are also not considered satisfactory to deception because they're still very hypothetical. And finally, there are the honest experiments, where the participant is completely made aware of the purpose of the research. So, for example, speed dating or improvement program studies. Now, debriefing. What is this all about? First of all, it's the final step that's conducted at during the research study. And it involves explaining to the participants the nature and the purpose of the study, especially when there was deception. And it's basically, the idea is to provide some level of emotional stability and an opportunity for the participant to recover from the experiences that they may have felt during the study. So what does the debriefing session entail? First, you should remember that it should progress slowly so that you don't rush the participant through it. And the researchers should make every attempt to bring back the participant to the same state that they were in at the start of the study. And the researchers should reiterate all assurances and guarantees that were given of confidentiality and anonymity that were made at the very start of the study. Now, this is a very important topic. How is data stored? Okay, so being ethical during data collection is vital. But when the participant is not there, we need to still deal with the data with as much ethics as we had when the participant was in front of us. So there are two things that need to be remembered during data storage. One is maintaining confidentiality. That means keeping all the information that was gathered private. And then ensuring anonymity. That is safeguarding an individual's identity so that you cannot directly associate any information gathered to this person. So you use codes, for example, when you're discussing that particular data. Now, finally, what has training got to do with it? So I'm asked this a lot by a lot of physicians when I send my interns or my students out for data collection. Is this person capable of collecting this data? Because there's a lot of emotion involved, especially in health psychology. And yes, all my students are trained. And it's important to ensure that they have this level of training so that they have the expertise and display the responsibility that involves in dealing with human participants. Because the researcher is the only individual who is ultimately responsible or accountable to the ethical conduct of this research study. Because I can't see what they're doing, right, at the field. So it's important that they display certain characteristics and that they have training. So they should have the necessary skills to conduct this experiment or the study. They should have the integrity, that is a characteristic, to ensure fairness, confidentiality, and anonymity. And I train them in terms of obtaining informed consent, and which also means before informed consent, they have informed the participant about what the study is, that they've received the requisite approvals, and that they've given the participant enough time to ask them questions, and then they obtain the informed consent. And then they have the ability to ensure that proper debriefing is done. So that means that they spend enough time with the participant after the interview is completed in answering any other questions or just allowing them to come back to their normal state. So with this, I've completed my talk, and thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, queries, comments, as usual, please email me at mahati@iith.ac.in. And I hope that this presentation has shed some light on how data should be gathered and how research should be conducted in the field of psychology. And I hope that this also will remind you of how noble and honorable a profession that we are engaged in, and how we are ultimately responsible to ensuring that we conduct our work in a noble and honorable and ethical manner. So with this little blurb, I'm done, and I hope you have a great Dashera and Deepavali up ahead. Bye.